Kia ora everybody and welcome. Good evening. Welcome to our online information event about our airport location study. We've actually got two audiences that are joining us tonight. We have our audience directly on Microsoft Teams, which everyone will be able to see. And in addition to that, we also have a live audience joining us on Facebook. So we're doing a live stream out to Facebook, and we are monitoring. We're monitoring that as well. Looks like there are about 20 people that have joined us live so far on Facebook. So good evening to you, and we'll be watching that number. It might drop, might fall as we go. So the location of our airport is currently out for consultation, and submissions will close only 1 week from today on the 25th of May 2022. To help people make an informed, to give an informed feedback on the 4 options that we've put out, we're holding a series of information events, and this is one of them. So for our online event tonight, we're joined by 3 expert airport consultants. First of all, we have Fraser Campbell. He's the project manager. Give us a wave, Fraser. Fraser is going to be our presenter tonight, so we're going to hear from him plenty. Joining him, we have Rick Pemberton. He's an airport specialist, especially around planning and the like. And we also have Graham Roberts, who's one of our technical specialists. The final person that you can see on your screen is Simon Weston. He's the Chief Executive of Whangarei District Council, and he'll be joining us for questions and so on as well tonight. So, of course, then there's me, and then there's Jane. So my name is Craig. You might see Jane's name come up at some point. Jane and I are part of the communications team. We're really just facilitating this session tonight and making sure that everyone gets a fair shake, gets a chance to ask their questions, and gets good information out of the evening. So you can help us with that as well, please. We'll just make sure that we just keep this really about information. While we know this can be an emotive topic, it might not be a great time to kind of campaign, if you will. So we're just trying to keep this as much about information as possible so that people can make informed submissions in the week that we have remaining until this closes. So I'll put it to our panel. Is there anything else that you'd like me to cover before we begin? Not by the looks. Well, in that case, Jane has started the presentation, and Fraser, you're our main presenter tonight. Take it away.
Thank you, Craig, and good evening. So, what are we looking at? What are we looking at as part of this proposal? It's a local government act provision that we're working with, but in terms of the nuts and bolts of what we're looking at is essentially trying to secure the future for air transport into Whangarei District. We want to hear what you think and what's important to you when it comes to choosing a future airport site. I want to emphasise that no decision has been made on the future of Whangarei Airport, Whangarei, and that this study is looking to the future. It's not dealing with the current operations of the existing airport. The airport operates well, it's well used, and it meets the current requirements. The project is looking out 30 years plus, and just as a sort of a reference, you'll see the existing airport on that slide, on that oblique aerial photograph there, and you'll see it's on the end of a peninsula at Whangarei, and the runway pretty much takes up the total width of the Whangarei Peninsula at that point, and there's the harbour either end of the runway. Okay, if we can move to the next slide. So this slide is talking about the 4 options that the statement of proposal that you can access from Council's website talks about. So you'll see the 3 proposed new sites, which are shown there as one of our presenters referred to as bow ties. So there's the northernmost one, which is the Ruatongata West, is in green colour. The next one closer to the city is called Ruatongata, and that's in that yellowy colour, and then you come down to the existing airport at Whangarei, which is in the blue bow tie, and then the southern location is the 1-2 Point West. Now, just to explain a little bit there, the actual the bow tie, or what we refer to as the obstacle limitation surface profiles that are shown there. In the centre, you'll have the runway, and then either end is what's referred to as the obstacle limitation fan, which talks about just trying to protect the approach and departure areas from an airport from obstacles, and that will include hills, towers, and other buildings that might obstruct the arrival and departure of an aircraft. So that slide will, as I said, gives you the location of the three new sites, as well as the location of the existing airport at Whangarei. So we'll now look at each of the sites individually, or each of the options. So Whangarei, which is our existing airport, I'll just cover on that. So that graphic shows you the location of the airport. So the red oval on the peninsula shows the general location of the airport, including the runway, the terminal, and all the other facilities that are part of an airport. You can also see its proximity to elevated ground. So generally speaking, that green area covers bush and elevated terrain. You've got the airport itself is surrounded by water, and the hashed area there talks about protected areas. They could be wildlife areas, or in the marine area, or even the bird wildlife areas as well. And you can see how close the existing Whangarei airport is to Whangarei city centre. Next slide, please. So this is a more detailed shot of that earlier slide we had, showing the obstacle limitation surfaces and those fans either end of the runway. And you'll see to the right of the runway some areas where the existing airport, where its impact, or where it actually impacts on the ground in terms of its obstacle limitation surfaces. So there's a lot of penetration through the obstacle limitation surface at the current airport, and we'll touch on that on the next slide. So we can just, so in terms of what we know about the existing runway at Whangarei, as you will recall from the aerial shot, that aerial oblique shot, it's a relatively short runway. It's in fact the shortest runway that Air New Zealand currently services in New Zealand. It's allowed to operate under old rules that the CAA had in place when, that the CAA, by the way, is the Civil Aviation Authority, that they had in place when the airport was first established. New rules, the new rules are now in place, wouldn't have allowed an airport at Whangarei to be certified. But because it was there, it's got what's often referred to as grandfather clause, which allows it to continue to operate. The other factor that's really important in this study is that Air New Zealand, who are the national carrier, are working through a process of looking at aircraft replacement into the future, and they've indicated this clearly to us that a longer runway will be needed to accommodate future regional aircraft that they are looking at the moment. And as I touched on a minute ago, there's also a concern that if the CAA in the future tighten up on some of the rules, particularly the ones that accommodate some of the older airports, that we may not be able to operate out of Whangarei in the long term. So moving on to what we have to consider, there's that potential inability to operate the airfield for regional commercial services, which is linked to Air New Zealand's replacement plan of aircraft. They're looking at potentially replacing aircraft within the next 10 years. They've got a program they're currently working on at the moment. we understand, we know the economic and social impacts to the district and the region if Air New Zealand wasn't able to operate their fleet out of an airport for Whangarei. We know the impact that would occur, and as we've touched on, there are a number of non-compliances with the existing airport, including in safety areas, runway strip deficiencies, and as I mentioned, the hills to the north east of the runway, in and around the Tamatarau area. So there's a real concern that if there's an incident at an airport in New Zealand or even potentially overseas, that some of these grandfather clauses may no longer be able to be utilised. Okay, so we move on to the next slide. So this is an opportunity now. We're going to do this between each of the options to provide an opportunity for people to ask questions about that option, the Onerahi option.
Great, thanks, Fraser. And yeah, so as questions come in, we're going to put them to the whole panel. So panel, ready your microphones. And we've just got a couple of questions about Onerahi, which may be to be expected. We're probably all quite familiar with it. The questions, though, are about what happens if there isn't an airport there. So actually, first I'm going to take this question from Corey. What are the plans for the Onerahi site if the airport is moved? How about a new hospital?
Okay, well, I'll kick off with a response. I think the key message or the key thing to understand with the Onerahi Airport, it is operated as a joint venture with New Zealand, with the Crown, so the New Zealand government, and they own the land on the site. So any decisions about what might happen to Onerahi if the airport was to move away from there would largely be based on, will be largely determined by government, central government, being the owner of the land. So there's been a whole range of suggestions made at different times, but that final decision will come down to government, and I'm sure local communities would certainly be interested in commenting and providing suggestions such as residential housing, and I guess there'll be a number of other options people would suggest.
Great, thanks. We've got one from Phoenicia as well. Here she asks, if we leave it where it is, can we offer a passenger ferry service from Whangarei South and other relevant areas to assist passengers getting to the airport? And I guess by extension, is there anything else we can do to make the current site more efficient?
So there's a couple of points in there. In terms of making the airport more efficient, there has been some significant work done looking at how that airport could be made to meet the current CAA rules, and there has been work, and which would include trying to looking to increase the runway length, the runway strip, and these runway end safety areas. That has been seen by council as being not a feasible option given the costs, but also the need to move into harbour reclamation, and that, generally speaking, is not seen to be an acceptable solution in current times. In terms of access to the airport, there have been suggestions at different times of fast ferries, say from the One Tree Point area, and that potentially could well be a good long-term solution if Onerahi stayed there to assist people from Onerahi, from the One Tree Point area to get to an airport.
That's great, thanks. We've got a question here from Ollie. He asks, wouldn't new aircraft types most likely be smaller, lower emission, and even maybe VTOL, which is vertical takeoff and landing, and thus not actually pose a problem for using Onerahi?
Would you like me to weigh in on that, Fraser?
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, it's a good question, Ollie. And I think one thing that people have been talking about is Air New Zealand's stated objective to adopt an alternate energy aircraft, an electric aircraft. And in the regional aircraft realm, it is electric aircraft that are likely to be the types that we see hopefully within the next 10 to 15 years. I guess the big question mark is around timing and what the capability of those aircraft are going to be. If you go on the internet, you'll see there's lots of pretty pictures and promises, etc. But the fact of the matter is we don't know what the performance of those aircraft types will be. Air New Zealand are going to need to replace those Dash 8s, as Fraser said, in sort of a 6 to 10 year horizon, depending on who you believe. So it's an immediate issue, and I mean, the technology might be there in 10 years, but this project's about mitigating the risk to not having regional air service. So it's going to be an interesting couple of years coming up because, as you may be aware, Sounds Air here in Wellington, where I am, had placed an order for an electric aircraft, although it's a fairly small, short-range aircraft. So we will be watching all of those developments with keen interest. Hopefully that answers your question, but yes, it could solve some of these issues, but we're looking at a very short runway. And until some of these new types are actually flying and we understand their performance better, it is still a significant risk to continued operations at the aerodrome.
And perhaps if I could just add a little bit more, you may be interested in looking at the Air New Zealand recently put out a document, and it's been very well written. It's aimed at suppliers of aircraft and associated elements go into an aircraft, but it's called Air New Zealand Zero Emissions Aircraft. So basically they've gone out to the market and saying, this is what we wanting to do. How can you help us achieve that? And one of the really exciting parts of it is that their focus in terms of trying to get some of this new technology into their fleet is on the type of aircraft that would fly in and out of regional airports and such as Whangarei. So they've got a plan to try and adopt some of this technology to help them reach the zero emissions, vision. And so they're probably more likely to trial out some smaller aircraft in the shorter term, maybe try some of the technology out on their freight aircraft rather than necessarily passenger ones. But in and around between the next 10 and 15 years, they would expect to be looking at replacement fleet. But they are saying that they're looking at the larger, the 50 seat plus, the 50 passenger plus type aircraft. And so their focus is on zero emissions, and they're looking at battery electric and hydrogen source powers or hybrid type planes to try and achieve that. At this stage, they haven't made any mention of vertical takeoff and landing planes, and neither have they put a particular focus on the short takeoff and landing aircraft such as the Dash 8 that currently comes into the airport. So their focus is starting not in terms of a particular type of aircraft, but more in terms of trying to get an aircraft its power source to meet their zero emissions vision. And so it's a slightly different approach, but it may actually deal with some of the questions you've raised.
Yeah, that's great. And bringing it back to what exists today. So Stuart asks, what size aircraft can Whangarei currently serve versus what size aircraft have we spec'd the new options for?
Back to you, Rick. Rick, you just need...
Classic mistake. Somebody had to do it. Sorry. So currently Air New Zealand flying the Dash 8. That's a 50 passenger aircraft type. It's got good short field performance, and that operates quite nicely from Auckland and Wellington. It used to operate from Wellington. When we started this project, one of the concerns was that, as you may recall, they'd phased out the Beech 1900s, which also had flown into Whangarei, 19-seater, fairly small, upgauge to the Dash 8, and we were looking at the fact that that aircraft was going to be phased out as Air New Zealand coalesced around a full ATR fleet. So the ATR 72, which is the next step up, 72 passengers, but requiring a longer runway. The reason around that, economics. It's a much more economical aircraft if you've got bums on seats to operate. So in terms of looking at a new site, and the criteria that we've been focused on is a 1,500-meter long runway, which would be the first stage of any development. That would service regional aircraft generally without any limitations. And it would certainly get you an aircraft here in the Whangarei district that would get you to Wellington and beyond. In terms of a second phase for the project and the site selection criteria, we've looked at an 1,800-meter long runway. That runway would be capable of taking your domestic, what we call a Code C jet, which is your 737s or your A320s. That is not long enough, we feel, for an international jet runway. So I guess to paraphrase, this has been looked at, certainly in terms of aerodrome design, around a regional facility that initially will serve large regional turboprops and could, in the second stage, be lengthened for regional jet services. Hope that answers your question.
Very thorough and technical, thank you. I think we better move on to some of the other sites actually, but just a reminder for everybody as well, we're going to be going back to more general questions once we've gone through each of the sites individually. So the next site we want to look at is what we call Site 6, also known as Ruatangata West.
Thanks, Craig. Let's go to the next slide. So Ruatangata West, as I mentioned earlier, this is the one that's of the two Ruatangata or northwest sites. This is the one furthest to the north from the city. Travel time in and around 20-25 minutes from the CBD. So this graphic shows the location of the general location of the airport surrounds in terms of runways and terminals, etc. You'll see the proximity to the Wairua River. The Wairua River is flowing down in the valley below where that airport location is shown in diagrammatic form, and adjacent to the site is Mitigai Road. In and around the area, the green is generally the bush areas, and the areas shown in the lighter green are wetland areas, and the darker bluey areas are areas that are protected or and also areas that so that darker blue are again elevated areas. So there's in the statement document, just the legend for that is provided, and you can see a little bit more detail about. But generally speaking, that's the location and some of the key features around the site. And you'll see that's distance from the State Highway 1. So, and I'll come back to that distance issue in terms of what we know. So, as I said, it's about a 20-kilometre drive from the city centre. Generally, access would be from Springs Flat area along Mitigai Road. And we know there's around about 64,000 people would live within half an hour's drive of the site. So that would be obviously those people who live in the city and the surrounding areas. The airport would be relatively easy to travel to and from. And we know in terms of what's officially scheduled, there are no sites of cultural significance or heritage sites. And that's not to say that there aren't any, it's just in terms of the information that's available at a desktop level or in published documents, there's nothing officially. But we do know of the importance of the Whangarei River to Mana Whenua and the local hapu. It generally has suitable geology, which tends to mean less intensive engineering. There's not major earthworks required to remove unsuitable soils, but there will be work required to develop the site for a runway and surrounding buildings, etc. It's unlikely to have major impacts on this existing infrastructure, such as things like impacting on major roads. There are no major pylons in the area, power pylons, and it doesn't impact on three waters. But bearing the three waters matter in mind, it is an isolated site and there are no reticulated water or wastewater systems in the area. What we need to consider is we are aware of there's a community of lifestyle and small blocks in and around that River Tongata West area. There's obviously the village hall, and up until recently, there's been a play centre in the area. We know that an airport and its operations increases the amount of background noise during flights, and there'll be associated lighting and traffic issues. It's likely to impact on local roads, and there would need to be significant upgrade of Pippiwai Road into the area, right back, more than likely, right back to State Highway 1 at Springs Flat. We're also aware that it's near the Hikurangi Swamp floodplain and the Wairoa River. And there are some local streams and irrigation dams in the area which would need to be considered. It may be a home to kiwi because there are at least 3 sites in the vicinity that have QE2 or Queen Elizabeth II Trust covenants on them, and there may well be lizards and native bats in the area. These are sort of the detail associated with those would have to be established in more detail if at this site or any of the other sites were established as being a proposed location. Move on to the next. So we're not spending a lot of time going through each of the sites in detail because the information is generally available in the statement of proposal, but it's more about giving you a brief summary and then opening up to questions on each site. Right?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Actually, I'm going to take the first question for myself. Used a bit of jargon there. What is meant by desktop study?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So in these types of projects, desktop studies are sort of a shorthand way of describing the studies are generally done using available information. So in this case, it would be published reports, information on various websites such as the Regional Council, Whangarei District Council's websites, and also other generally published information. So it as opposed to going on to a particular site and doing detailed investigations there. So looking at going in and doing soil samples, looking at taking samples out of local streams, trying to do surveys of fauna and flora. That's what we mean by a desktop. So it's basically doing anything. It's not requiring you to do on-site investigations.
Great, thanks. Actually, I'm going to come back to this question may also relate to Whangarei, but David was wondering, will Nest have to move if the airport is relocated? And if so, why move Nest now?
Okay, good question. So as part of the project, we've Council established a project advisory group and of key stakeholders, and NEST was part of that group because it was recognised that when this project was initiated, that ultimately we would be looking at an airport that would accommodate NEST. So, but what's obviously happened in the fullness of time is that NEST's existing site has become an issue. So I can't, and we're not able to talk on behalf of NEST clearly. But the intention is that NEST, that a future airport site, in terms of the 3 new sites, would accommodate an operation such as NEST and a range of other aviation, general aviation, as well as the scheduled regional airport flights.
Very good, thanks. And that brings us to Corey's question. What's actually the projected number of daily flights and air traffic for the site, and what would the hours of operation be?
Yeah, well, yeah, they're good technical questions. And so as a guide, we can probably talk about obviously that in New Zealand have a current schedule of flights into Whangarei. So the expectations are that schedule would be maintained. There's always an issue with potentially if a larger aircraft was to be used at for example, at one of these 3 new sites, that there may be reduced numbers of flights. So you've got more capacity, so you have less flights. Generally, what's happened is that the numbers of people flying in and out of Whangarei has been increasing over the years. So we would anticipate that demand would continue to grow, and the number of flights in and out would probably be the 4 that we currently have at the moment. But actually what occurs in the future is entirely dependent on the demand that Air New Zealand can service and the number of people who are wanting to fly in and out of Whangarei.
Very good, thanks. And we've got a bit of a theme coming through about both Ruatangata sites. What about the fog? People say it's a really foggy site. The Hikurangi Swamp is known for its fog. How does that affect the site?
Rick, can you respond to that initially?
Yeah. Well, I guess that is an issue that we're well aware of, and we did rule out a site in the swamp primarily because of that. As Fraser had indicated, this has been a desktop study to date, and one of the things that we want to do, if there's a site identified other than Onarahi that's favored, is we will want to put a a meteorological station on that site to start collect data. So yes, we're aware it's an issue, and it's something we need to understand more about. And this next phase of work is about getting access to a site so that we can start to do some of those detailed investigations to confirm, we hope, or otherwise, the continued suitability of that site. So yes, it's an issue we're aware of, and yes, we need to do more work to understand it more fully. In terms of standards, maybe just another little fact, if you look at the International Civil Aviation Organization usability criteria, you want to be able to use a site approximately 95% of the time. So roughly that equates to 30 days downtime. It depends on the time of day, but there are criteria around usability also. So something to look that we need to look into in the future.
Yeah, and if I might just add to that, also, the fog is a problem that we have throughout the country, and most airports in New Zealand have at some time of the year a problem with fog. Both sites 6 and 9 are elevated above the general level of the swamp, but it's fair to say that we don't know the exact extent of fog and its period, its time the fog is present in the morning. The other thing that's probably worth touching on is that as the new aircraft are being supplied with even more advanced avionic equipment that enables them to fly into airports that they may not have been able to fly into 10, 15 years ago. And that sort of capability does assist in flying into airports where the conditions may not be the best they could be. So it does provide a little bit more flexibility, but it's not certainly fog is a really important thing to take into consideration.
Great, thanks. A question from Deborah here. Are properties that are adjacent to the airport site likely to have a change in their zoning?
Perhaps I can field that one, Fraser. It's early days yet, but the expectation is there will be a plan change required to provide for the airport operations at whichever site is selected. Plus, it's likely there will be a wider area of plan change to allow for associated activities with the airport. And I noticed from the questions in the chat that someone's asking about what are the positive benefits from the airport. One of the positive benefits from airports around the world is it generally stimulates economic activity and businesses in the vicinity of the airport. So you tend to get things like car hire companies, you get tourism providers, you often get air freight companies establishing in the proximity of the airport. You often also get specialist aircraft engineering companies established there. So determining how much land needs to be set aside for that is often quite tricky, but it's something that will need to be looked at in more detail in the next stages of the study once a site is confirmed.
Very good, thanks. I've got a couple of questions here from John about site selection, I guess. First of all, would we look at steeper or curvier approach paths? And what about birds at the four proposed sites? Bird hazards, he means.
Rick, can you deal with that, the initial response to that, please?
You're still muted, Rick.
At this stage, we've looked at a standard set of obstacle limitation surfaces, which are based around visual approach and departure procedures. We do have have had a specialist approach designer on the team. That's a bit of a black art. So at this stage, we haven't looked at curved approaches. We have looked at what sort of types of approaches would be available at the various sites. So that is something that we would look at in a little bit more detail, depending on which site is chosen and following some further investigation. In terms of bird hazard, again, that's a bit of a detail issue. Certainly looking at the ecology on the chosen site will be a big part of the next stage. And that's not just birds, it's other ecological features and animals, etc.
Very good, thanks. We've got a few other kind of general questions coming in about Rua Tangata and about all sites. We will make sure that we address those, but I think maybe we'll move on to the next one, what we call Site 9, just known as Rua Tangata.
Thanks, Craig. So again, similar sort of graphic that we've seen with the site slightly closer to town, still accessed off Fenugpai Road, bounded by Kokopū Road and 3 Mile Bush Road. And you can see the surrounding areas of bush in the green and wetlands and swamps and significant topographical variation. So basically the high ground in that darker blue. And again, you'll see the Wairua River and a tributary of the Wairua River, the Whangarei River, and then the Wairua stream, in which would go, in terms of this general location, runs through the site. You'll also get a bit of a feel for the location of the site in relation to the Hikurangi swamp area. You can see parts of that swamp in there, and whilst it's adjacent to, it's generally to the south and elevated from the Wairua, the Hikurangi swamp, which is drained, as you'll see, by the Wairua River. Right, we can just move to the next slide. So again, what do we know about it? You'll see it's slightly closer to town, so it's 17 kilometres versus 22 kilometres for the Ruatongata West site. Again, the same sort of rough number of people within half an hour's drive. Similar comments about access to and from the airport as a location. And again, no officially scheduled sites of cultural significance, although as part of our discussions during the consultation, we have had feedback about the importance of that tributary, the Wairua, the Patu Wairua stream. The geology is generally suitable. There is a bit of more of a mix of the geology on this site when compared with site 6. And again, the same sort of comments about unlikely to have major impacts on infrastructure like existing major roads or the Transpower or local power company power lines. Again, it's remote from existing council infrastructure in terms of Three Waters. In terms of what we need to consider, there are, again, the lifestyle blocks. In and around the area, there's the Matarau School and adjacent kindergarten. There's some lifestyle blocks in the general over the approach paths in the Royden Drive area. One of the things that would potentially be required with an airport at this site would be some diversion of potentially Kokapū Road and Atwoods roads. We know that the value of the Patu Wairua stream in terms of its species that exist in the stream and the flora and fauna in and around that stream. There are potentially some wetlands in the area as well. The area is closer to the Pukenui Hills and potentially within the flight path of bats and other birds, and there may be lizards in the area. And we know that in the general vicinity, we're in the general vicinity of the Whangarei River, which is a conservation area. So again, questions about Ruatongata Site 6.
Very good, thanks, Tim. Hey, the first question is from Tara. She asks, has land already been purchased? And if so, why has that been done already before deciding on a preferred site?
Just wondering whether you'd like to respond to this, Simon, or would you want me to do that?
Fraser, thank you. No, I'm quite happy to respond to this one. Council has purchased land in the Ruatongata site. It's the only site that they've purchased land in for this project. And at the time, a farm was up for sale, and the farm incorporated the majority of the land that was needed for the actual aerodrome. So council decided at that point in time that it would purchase that land and protect it. It also purchased some adjacent blocks and some lifestyle blocks that were adjacent to it as well. So yeah, council's only purchased in this site, and that's really to try and protect the site from further development and subdivision. The other sites don't have such a large single one-off block of land as per this particular site, and council at this point doesn't see itself purchasing any more land until it's made a decision over which site it's going to progress. It's fair to say that when council purchased the land, it hadn't made a decision on which was the favoured site, and that work was still to be done. Indeed, as Fraser's mentioned earlier, council hasn't made a decision yet to leave Whangarei either. Hope that answers your question.
Very good, thanks. To extend the question, what happens to that land if another site is chosen?
Council will have an option then as to whether it wishes to maintain that land within its property portfolio, or indeed sell it back to the market. The land at the moment, the farm that council purchased, it's being operated as a farm and leased out.
Yeah, very good, thanks. Following on, oh, sorry.
Craig, if I could just add one more final point to that. I think it's really important to be aware that whilst council has purchased some land for one site, it in no way indicates its preference as its proposed location. So there has been various comments made about council buying land, and that really indicates its preference. In terms of its proposed site, I just need to emphasise that council hasn't made a decision on its proposed site, and the purchase of land is more of a trying to deal with a potential loss of opportunity to locate an airport at that site, rather than a decision to make that decision. So it's really important to recognise it's in no way made a decision on where the airport will be located.
Very clear, thanks. So coming back to planning for if there was going to be an airport at Rua Tangata, what would be done for road access, public transport, road widening? How about rural access? This is a question from Tony. Okay.
So there have been discussions with NZTA. NZTA, or Waka Kotahi, are a member of the project advisory group. And they've been consulted on or been involved in the process, looking at all the sites. So initial discussions have been around potential access, improving access to State Highway 1 at Springs Flat, as I indicated, and this relates to both 6 and 9, and a program of upgrade to Mitigai Road to improve the alignments and improve shoulder widths, etc. Part of the discussions with Waka Kotahi have also been around to ensure that, as part of their overall approach, is to ensure that provision is made for public transport to be provided to such an airport. They see that as part of their multimodal approach. And we've also had a request from Kiwi Rail. They're very interested in being part of the program going forward in terms of how it may impact on their network. So certainly discussions with the state highway operator, discussions about upgrading Mitigai Road, and also the provision of some form of public transport mainly from the central business area out to if an airport was located here or any of the other sites.
Very good, thanks. I think actually the other questions we have about this site kind of apply to all sites, so we might just save those towards the end and get on to One Tree Point West. Okay, so this is quite a different location and quite different characteristics from the previous two sites. It's site 6 and 9 at Rua Tangata and Rua Tangata West. As you'll see from the graphic, it's the southern location. It's on the entrance to the Whangarei Harbour and borders onto Green Bay. You'll see again the same sort of high ground in the darker blue, the green areas being the bush, and the hashed area in the harbour reflecting protected or zones in terms of fishing. Sorry, not so much fishing, in terms of marine reserves and wildlife protection.
And then moving to the next slide. Now, what we know about the site, this is of the three locations, the three new locations. This is the one with the longest distance from the centre, from the city centre. So it's 30-kilometre drive. Now we know, because of this One Tree Point area being part of a growth area within the city, you'll see that the number of people that live within 20 to 30 minutes drive of the site is of the order of 55,000 people, and that is likely to increase as growth continues in that area. Of the three sites, this is probably the easiest one to travel to. It's got the longest travel time, but it is got the most immediate access to the state highway network, both State Highway 1 to the roundabout at Relocated, and then State Highway 15 out and past the site out to the port. There's a lot of land in and around the area that's either light or heavy industrial, which would assist any future industrial business activity around the airport along the lines of what Graham Roberts referred to. We also know that the area is well connected to Northport, and it's in close proximity to the designation that Kiwi Rail has on a rail freight link out to the port. And we also are aware of plans to increase the capacity of Northport to become more of a container terminal. Now, what we need to consider is potential impacts of noise for the airport's operation, including lighting and general activity associated with an airport. So this site has got significant proximity to residential areas that the other two sites don't have, and that makes the issues of noise and the general operation of an airport likely to impact on a significantly larger number of people. We also know with our discussions with Pataharakiki that the area Marsden Point down Ruakaka has, in terms of Popo Whenua, and there's a reserve in that area. It is of significant cultural significance to Pataharakiki, who are the mana whenua of the area. We know that there are two scheduled culturally significant sites in the vicinity of or nearby to the proposed location. Takahiwai Marae is generally located to the west of the proposed site. I've already touched on the fact that this site is near and part of Council's growth strategy, with an area that's been identified for residential growth as well as business and other commercial growth. And that has pluses and minuses for this project. Part of the area is susceptible to flooding, and it's probably the only area that potentially would be impacted by tsunami. There are some small watercourses in the area, but being on the coast, it doesn't have quite the same sort of stream watercourses that the other two sites have. There may be some wetlands in the area in the vicinity of the airport footprint that might need to be dealt with and managed. And again, native flora and fauna. And in particular, this site, being on the coast, is more likely to have impacts and be affected by seabirds when compared with the other two sites. We also know that this site's probably got the least suitable in terms of geology. Any of you who will be familiar with that Bream Bay, in particular the Ruakaka area, One Tree Point, will know that the large amounts of peat in the area. So that peat would have to be removed and be replaced with a suitable fill material, because the peat would not make a suitable foundation for an airport. So on to questions again.
That's great, thanks. And yeah, they're coming in thick and fast. Actually, there's a bit of a trend emerging here. People wondering about noise and noise mitigation. So there's a few people have asked about that. Let's take a look at that one first.
Is there a specific question there, guys?
Sorry, so I guess the question would have to be, what can be done to mitigate the noise at an airport?
Can you start off with that one on Graham?
Yes, I can start with that one. Generally, an airport will have a noise mitigation plan attached to it, which may or may not operate limiting, may or may not limit operating hours. And you will generally do a noise contour plan for an airport, and there are certain guidelines contained within district plans to address those matters. So when you're starting with a fresh airport site in a greenfield situation, you have the opportunity to make some consequential adjustments to your land use plans to make sure that noise sensitive activities like residential areas and schools and old people's homes and hospitals and the like are not located within noise extensive areas within the general direction of the runway or the flight path.
Thank you. There's another bit of a trend coming through, people talking about tsunami risk. And actually, I think an interesting one here, Diane asks, will roading be expanded in One Tree Point? And I guess the implication there is roading to the airport, where it may also be at risk of tsunami.
Okay, so I'll just take that in two parts. So in terms of the roading, as I mentioned, the airport option at One Tree Point is within very close proximity of the state highway system, and in particular State Highway 15. There would need to be an upgrading of access from State Highway 15 to an airport located at One Tree Point, and it's most likely that that two roads within that location would need to be either closed or relocated to provide for the runway. Now, so in turning to the second half in relation to tsunami, the issue of tsunami has come up a couple of times during the consultation process, and the amount of work has been done looking at tsunami risk, and that would be subject, if this airport, this site was chosen as a proposed airport, there would be a separate study looking at the tsunami risk and how that might impact, or how the site could be built to try and to respond or to be able to withstand the tsunami. Tsunami is quite specific to the location in terms of the effect that a tsunami might have. In this particular area, it's very open coast. Bream Bay is a very open area, so it would have to be specifically looked at, including roading access, heights of the runway itself, and any facilities that would be part of the airport. That would be looked at specifically. So at this stage, we haven't looked at it in detail, and it would need to be as part of the specific and detailed studies that would go after a site was selected.
Very good, thanks. And staying on the topic of access, Diane asks if the rail spur could be made available for airport use, and David asks, could we run an express train and a Harbour Cat ferry to Whangarei Central from the proposed One Tree Point West site? Yeah,
I really do like these suggestions. In terms of the rail link, it's primarily from the discussions that I've picked up on, and the discussion we've been having that have been had with Kiwi Rail. It's primarily a freight route. And as to whether there be any passenger links by way of rail, that would be something that I guess Kiwi Rail would have to be just discussed with Kiwi Rail in detail to see what their thinking was. I particularly like the idea of high-speed access from the CBD to, if an airport was proposed in this area. There have been discussions about linking Whangarei Point with the existing airport. That's come up in discussions, and a link through to the CBD may be a useful connection, say, for example, for cruise boats coming into the harbour, and it could well be a good way of linking the CBD with an airport in that location, and it would certainly be quicker in a general situation than driving out along State Highway 1 and 15.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. And also about just the way the airport gets used. John asks, is there any chance of the airport being a site for the NZAF, the Air Force, if the Fenugpai base is closed?
Simon, we've had some discussions on this. Simon, would you like to comment on that?
We see any of these sites being domestic, and we don't see that there would be any Defence Force activity associated with any of these sites. And we don't really, all our conversations to date have suggested that these sites would remain as purely domestic regional locations.
Yeah, so to answer the question, in terms of to expand on what Simon said, those discussions have taken place with New Zealand Defence Force, and as you've picked up, there's been all sorts of comments in the press over the last few years about other defence activities being relocated to Whangarei Point, but at this stage, there's no certainty in any of those. So planning is all about it being a civilian airport rather than any sort of military airport.
Great, that's probably as much as we can say there.
Probably just to add to that, I mean, discussions have highlighted the need for, or highlighted the fact that military aircraft are a lot noisier than domestic aircraft, and they would need some where there wouldn't be any reverse sensitivity associated with those types of airports. They'd also be looking for a much longer type runway than a normal domestic aerodrome runway.
It's very good, thank you, Simon. Just getting back to the site specifically then, Corey is wondering, because Whangarei Point is coastal, would that mean less impact on residential areas in terms of noise, and also would the coastal environment mean lower frequency of fog? I think maybe can we just explore a little bit what a coastal site would mean for an airport?
So in a general sense, it's a little bit hard at this stage to generalise in terms of fog, because we know potentially coastal areas have problems with fog, by way of example, Auckland and Wellington airports. In terms of the other interesting feature about an airport that's located near the coast is that, and this is a good example, is where you would have quite large, potentially quite a lot of the approach and departure would be over water. So that has the advantage of probably you'd have less limitations on building within people being able to build or undertake activities within those approach and departure fans. And reflecting on what I said a few minutes ago, as a coastal location, this one is the nearest to existing and potentially future residential areas. It's not something unique to a coastal location, but this particular coastal location is nearest the residential areas.
Perhaps worthwhile adding to, Fraser, that the One Tree Point site has generally been identified as a strategic urban growth area for Whangarei's future long-term expansion. So we'd have to carefully consider a trade-off between the restrictions associated with an airport in this location and future development of either more residential or a mixture of residential, commercial and industrial as a growth node.
Yes, and that's a good point, because there has, and the planning for this location as a growth node to the district has been taking place over a long number of years. And what's actually been happening over the last few years has been a bit of a switch around from some of the initial expectations of it being more business oriented to expand into more residential activities. So that's been quite an interesting trend, and it's something that's going to be an important input in terms of decision making on where the proposed site might go.
Very good, thanks. We've just got a few more questions about One Tree Point West, and then we might try and move on to some of the general questions which are building up. So first of all, Diane asks about One Tree Point West. What roads would be removed if we were building an airport there?
Okay, so I mentioned at the moment the runway alignment that where the indicative runway alignment cuts across One Tree Point. We're at in the vicinity of McCarthy Road and that McEwen Road, no, sorry, in that vicinity, and it also would cut through Pyle Road East. Now, there are, as part of the developments, the residential developments to the north, Marsden Cove and the landing, there are going to be some new links that come round as part of those subdivisions. So there may be possible to link Pyle Road East in with those, and potentially come back towards State Highway 15. And there's also potential to be able to relocate One Tree Point Road in and around off Takahiwai Road and around and then back onto its current alignment. So there's some options we've looked at at a very general level to still maintain the level of service and the roading links in there, but they would have to be changed. If an airport was constructed in this area, there wouldn't be need to some road closures and some new alignments of existing roads.
That's great, thanks. I have three technical questions which we'll allow through. So first of all, one here from Chris. How would the issue of peat soil in this location be mitigated?
Would you like to deal with that to start with, Rick, or would you like me to deal with that one?
Well, I'm not being the geotechnical engineer, but I think in general that that material would have to be either digged out and replaced with something more stable, or we'd have to look at foundations that can be a raft or a pile system, but those would be very expensive. But yeah, we'd have to get some geotechnical engineers, and unfortunately we don't have one on the call, but yeah, that's something we would have to look at in detail. Sorry, very general issue, not my area of expertise.
No, that's all right, Rick. We can add that as part of the team that has looked at all the sites, we have had specialist advice in that area. And that's why we've raised it as something that needs to be considered about this site, given the amount of peat that's there, and the construction industry's got familiarity with developing in this area in terms of the Marsden City area, where large amounts of peat have been removed as part of roading developments, putting in services and making land available for housing. So There is reasonable experience in the area of how to deal with the peat, but generally speaking, the advice we've got is that it would need to be where there's peat in the area, we would need to remove it and stable fill put in place for a runway and other buildings associated with the airport.
Yeah, I guess just following on from that, Fraser, I mean, the aim of this is to be able to get this exercise is if a alternative site is chosen, is that we get access to the site and can start to do things like geotechnical investigations, what have you, to better define what the engineering solutions for the site will be and mitigation and all those good things.
Yep.
Great, thanks. So 2 more quick technical questions. John says that he thinks that the predominant winds across, the predominant winds at that site would be across the runway. How has that been considered?
Yep, so we have looked generally at crosswind limits. Again, we'd like to get a Met Service site there. I think it's been stated in the consultation that there is room to adjust these runway alignments. We certainly haven't finalized them. They are very general pictorial alignments that are shown. So crosswind limits are certainly something we're aware of, and those will be considered in consideration of the aircraft types that we have, and again, around those usability criteria for a runway. So very important to get a meteorological station on whichever site is put forward.
Great, thanks. Oh,
just to expand on that, but this was one of the key considerations right at the beginning of the study in terms of runway alignments. We were advised as part of that early part of the study that some of the limits we were looking at could be relaxed, given that in more recent aircraft are more capable of taking crosswinds than perhaps when we first started looking at the site. So there seems to be a little bit more capacity in terms of the modern aircraft to deal with a bit more crosswinds than perhaps we initially envisaged as well.
Yeah, I'd have to say it's fair. We haven't found the perfect site, and we certainly weren't fooling ourselves that would be the case. But yeah.
That's great, thanks. This guy John, I reckon, might be a pilot, because he also asks, in terms of airspace for the Whangarei Point site, has there been consideration for moving the low-flying area that's nearby?
I believe you're talking about the protection area around the Marsden Point facility. Is that correct?
Unable to check with him in real time, sorry, but let's presume that.
Okay. Well, we haven't looked at removing that limitation. There is protected airspace around the exhaust stack on Marsden Point. And as I'd said earlier, we did have a specialist who looks at approach and departure issues check out all of these sites. So if it is that Whangarei Point site, I think it depends on what the continued use of that facility is going to be, which I understand is still up for discussion. Yeah, sorry, can't give you a definitive answer on that one.
But I think it's fair to say that we were made aware right at the beginning of that airspace in and around the refinery, and it's certainly been a key consideration looking at runway alignments in that area.
Very good. Finally, before we move on from Whangarei Point West, we've got a kind of two-sided question here. So this is from Tara, who's in the Teams chat. Tara asks, how do we consider individuals who buy and invest in areas that then change, basically? And on the flip side of that, what are seen as the positive benefits or opportunities for having an airport in your immediate vicinities?
Graham, can you kick off?
Do you want me to? I'll have the first crack at this.
Yeah.
One. Well, Tara, that's a great question, because as I often say to people, when councils and other infrastructure providers are considering major facilities, it's a question of balancing up the needs of individuals versus the needs of the district as a whole, and that's an awkward conversation to have, and it's an awkward discussion to have with individual landowners. When an individual is buying a piece of land, it's not unusual for them to do due diligence by going and looking at the district plan and what the district plan is proposing for their area. But as we all know, district plans can and do change and respond to changing circumstances. One of the key features about this as a major piece of infrastructure is that council is proposing to proceed by lodging a notice of requirement to get a designation in place. Now that importantly offers to individual landowners who are affected, it offers them, once, if and when a designation for the airport is confirmed, if an individual's land is affected, it offers that individual the opportunity to ask council to acquire its interest in that land. And that's a fair market valuation that's undertaken on the basis of a willing seller, willing buyer, and those matters occur. So very difficult to answer in specific cases, but there will be affected parties with all sorts of major facilities such as this, and there is an existing mechanism in place in the Resource Management Act and the associated Public Works Act to allow for these matters to be resolved. In relation to the second part of the question, as I said earlier, airports are attractors of and initiators of significant business activities and opportunities. So again, even if you were lucky enough to be immediately adjacent to the airport, if your land was not needed for the airport, there's a good possibility that your land may well be have its value enhanced by the presence of the airport, because there may well be alternative uses which you may not have considered at the time you bought your land. But again, a long process to go through in the Resource Management Act in order to get a designation for the airport in place, and potentially also a long parallel process to get a plan change in place for associated business activities for the airport. And both of those processes have the opportunity for individuals to make submissions, lodge objections, and make submissions before an independent hearings panel before a decision is taken.
And I think also part of that question was Graham referred to some of the positives that may come from an airport being in location, but clearly there are the what people would see as the negatives associated with being in close proximity to an airport and the effects that might have on their particularly residential property values. And that's something that council has to consider when it makes its decision on where it goes with the four options and weighs things up. Perhaps I could add that in terms of the value of an airport, council had some work done about 3 or 4 years ago, looking at the value of having an airport in an area, and that in particular having an airport for the Whangarei district. So basically the question was asked, if there wasn't an airport in the Whangarei district, what impact would it have on the economy of the district and the region? And what it came out of that was basically saying the airport, having an airport provides an extra value to that to the district of something of the order of $400 million. So you can see it's an airport from that study is shown to be a really important part of the infrastructure associated with the district, and that's reflected in pretty much every major town in New Zealand having an airport in close proximity. In New Zealand, I wouldn't say it's unique, but it does have quite a large number of airports per head of population. And I think that's partly reflecting the type of transport routes we have, the type of geology and the type of ground conditions and the shape and amount of hills we have. we don't tend to have high-speed rail links between cities, so we tend to deal with it by way of having a greater density of airports, and hence the value of having an airport to a district and a community.
Thanks, team. And just moving on from here, I just want to acknowledge that we all know this is a very sensitive topic, and will have a major impact on any location that it goes into. So following on from that, let's move into the next slides and look at what actually does happen next. Who makes this decision? Okay,
so we, as Craig indicated at the beginning of the information evening, the consultation process is coming to an end on the formal consultation in terms of submissions, coming to an end next Wednesday, the 25th. It's been running for 4 weeks, so the total period of 5 weeks. And you can make it your submission either doing it online, or you can get a copy from service centres of the proposal document and fill it out manually and leave it at the council service centres. Subsequent to that, on the Thursday, the 9th of June, council will hear from people who want to talk to the councillors about the proposal, and they can speak in support of their submission. And then council at the end of June, so on the 30th of June, we'll meet to consider whether they would want to proceed with one of the 3 preferred sites, or whether they want to continue using the Whangarei site in the longer term. So just to reiterate again, council will continue to use the Whangarei airport at least for the next 5 to 10 years, based on the current information. So that's the process from here. After the closing of consultation by way of submissions, we'll then have hearings, and then council is proposing to make a decision by the end of June on where it will go. And then after that, as Graham has touched on, there's another whole process. If they elect to proceed with one of the 3 3 preferred sites, there'll be a whole more detailed study required, looking at and trying to answer some of the questions that you've raised today about the 3 preferred sites in relation to fog, in relation to flora and fauna, in relation to the rivers and streams and wetlands, aeronautical issues, just all the planning issues. There's just a social impact, cultural impact assessments. There's just a really long number of studies that would be required to support any future designation process. But that's all in the future, because what we're really dealing with at the moment is what we're looking at in the next 6 weeks.
Thanks, team. So that brings us to some of the general questions that we've had come up. So these have come up during the whole presentation, and anyone on the live stream. We've still got 55 people watching live on Facebook, and a few in Teams as well. You're welcome to stay for this part, or not. We've also put the link to learn more and have your say into the chat in both platforms. So feel free to jump in there, click the link, and go and let us know what you think. So the first of these general questions, let's have just a look through some of the process here. So Carolyn asks, how can council make a fully informed decision in June if they haven't conducted on-site investigations?
Yep, that's a very fair question. So it's a question that really relies, it comes back to the process council's used. Council elected to go to the community with a range of choices in terms of sites, and they've gone to the community with 4 options, including staying where they are at Whangarei. the process that's been worked through over the last 8 years has looked at a large number of sites, starting with 28 sites and then coming down to 5 and then ultimate to these 3 preferred sites. Now, until council was able to go public and identify these sites, they didn't have the ability to go onto properties to undertake the sort of detailed investigations that we've touched on during the last hour or so. You cannot go on and do geotechnical investigations and do water sampling and a whole range of things that are required. You can't just do that in some sort of incognito way without the permission of the property owners. And so it was felt that the best way of doing it was to do as much as we could with the published and generally available information, of information that would be available from driving along surrounding roads and seeing the sites from those sort of perspectives. So it's a fair question to ask to how much effort you need to do to be able to identify a site that you want to proceed to designation. So it's a balance point, and so council decided that this is the process, or this is the process they wanted to proceed in terms of when they went public. And I think it's fair to say that as part of that process, if they choose a particular site as their proposed location, and it turned out that with the detailed on-site investigations that there was a fatal flaw on that site, they would not be able to proceed through to the next phase, which is designation. They would have to basically regroup and have a serious think about where they were going. So it's because this whole process to be able to build a new airport needs to go through a very rigorous RMA process that Graham talked about. That's the sort of next checkpoint along this line, and they wouldn't, if there were some fatal flaws that were identified on a proposed site, as I said, council would have to rethink their approach, and because they would be unlikely to get consents on a site that didn't meet the RMA requirements.
Great. That actually flows very neatly into another question. Zoe has been holding on to this. So what if, just worst case scenario, council chooses a site and then they do go and investigate? When you say they'd have to go back to the drawing board, what exactly would that look like? What if a site that they'd selected became unsuitable?
Yeah, well, we haven't sort of really gone into the sort of the pros and cons of that, but I mean, obviously you have when you look at we've got 3 preferred sites, which have been through a fairly rigorous process to date, and they all whilst they all have pros and cons, you could physically build an airport at any of those 3 sites. So if, for example, you've found a fatal flaw on one site, there is potential to go back to the other 2 sites, or the Onerahi site, the existing Onerahi site. So, or there may be something that maybe some more information comes to hand that you might cast your net a bit wider, but it's somewhat hypothetical at this stage. But certainly there are, one of the benefits of actually having 3 options in terms of new locations is that we believe they're all workable solutions. Those sites are not haven't been put up because we wanted 3 sites. They're all practical, workable solutions, and they could be go back to looking at the other 2 sites that preferred sites that weren't selected in this process.
Great. So that brings us to another theme that we've had during the session tonight, which is, how did you come up with these sites in the first place, and what happened to Marta, and what about if I've got an idea for a better site?
Okay, that's a very fair question. We do have a couple of slides that might help a little bit, if we can perhaps just go to those. So as I mentioned, the process which has started off in 2014, looking at the existing location, and then looking at another site that was proposed now called Port Meekhoun. Council looked at what was the requirements you would have for building a new airport, and that process is what helped generate the 28, what we call the long list of 28 sites. So the first criteria was ensuring that a site could meet CAA rules and operational requirements, and Rick talked about that in response to some of the questions. And also making sure that an airport and its surrounding area could be safely operated from the site. We looked at these issues of cultural heritage and ecological significance, which we've talked about for the 3 locations. And we've also looked at a range of other things that have looked at, what's come through in some of the questions in terms of soil types, in terms of rivers and streams, location in proximity to Whangarei, conflict with other infrastructure, roading access issues, and a range of other things. But they've all been assessed on those 28 sites, and there's been an assessment process that's used to try and rank those sites. So we took the 28 and found the best 5 out of that 28, and then did some further studies on those 5 sites, and then were able to reduce it down to these 3 preferred sites. So it's like going through a series of screens or filters or sieves, and each time you go through, you're using a finer and finer screen to try and make sure that what you end up is some sites that have real prospects of being good airport locations.
That's great, thanks. And we covered this question at the start, but just coming back to it because it's come up again. But what's the kind of time frame we're talking about here? How long would it take to actually complete a build?
Okay, so as Graham indicated, the first stage, once assuming council makes a decision at the end of June on one of the 3 preferred locations, there's a process for that more detailed investigations of the proposed site, and that would all be and that would include a further more detailed consultation process on that proposed site through the RMA requirements, and it would be leading towards what's been referred to as a designation or a notice of requirement to try and protect the land associated with an airport, and also protect and try and give an indication of those obstacle limitation surface fans to try and protect those as part of the designation process. So that because what we know is that and that process might take a couple of 3 years, but the idea is to protect a site so that when a new airport was required, given that council would be moving away from Whangarei, that when the conditions that required a new airport to be constructed, that might be 10 years away, they might be 15 years away. It's subject to those factors we talked about at the beginning. Air New Zealand's fleet replacement program, what does that look like? What type of aircraft do they want to operate? And it also relates to the CAA limitations on the existing site. If anything comes out of the way that CAA are applying the rules, it might mean that council needs to relocate from the existing airport. So what our expectation is, site designated in maybe the next 3 to 4 years, and then once we get a clearer picture about when a new airport would be required, the plan change that Graham talked about would come into the picture, and there'd also potentially be some resource consents that might be required from the regional council in terms of earthworks and diversions and water takes. There could be a range of things. So we could be looking for building a new airport and having a new airport operating maybe in 15 years' time. Bit hard to tell. And again, that new airport might, once the first stage is built, it might take some time for the airport itself and its surrounding precincts. It might take quite a long time for a fully fledged airport with all its associated activities to be fully constructed and operating. I think Rick talked about maybe initially building a 1,500-metre runway, and maybe at some stage in the future that might be the runway formation might be extended to 1,800 metres. Again, that's dependent upon the demand for the users for that airport. So it's sort of not an easy. There's no sort of definitive timeline as to this will happen in 2026 and this will happen in 2030. It's really dependent on a whole lot of factors coming together. But as I said right at the beginning of the evening, this whole thing is about council managing the risk of there potentially being a need to shift from Whangarei, and having all the planning and having all the work done so that if the risk changed and there was a need to move, they would be well prepared for that, for any change, and there would be a council would be able to ensure that be a continuation of aviation services to the district. And really that's what the whole project's about.
Great, thanks. So a more general question here, I guess, from Ollie. It says that it sounds like a lot of why we'd need to move from Whangarei is actually to keep Air New Zealand happy. If they decided not to serve Whangarei anymore, couldn't we just allow other operators with compatible and smaller aircraft to replace them? Are we that dependent or tied to Air New Zealand as the operators into Whangarei?
Yeah, and you know, a really good question, and it's come up before with some of our information evenings. Obviously, Air New Zealand currently is the only operator with a timetabled service to Whangarei. It hasn't always been the case. I can remember probably 20 odd years ago we had another network, national network operator coming in and serving Whangarei, but they obviously they're no longer servicing, and they're no longer in operation. But we do have Ansett who do the main trunk routes, so there's potential for at some stage a day coming back. I think the important point is that we've discussed closely with Air New Zealand what we're doing and what their plans are, and to some extent Air New Zealand's a bit of a proxy for what a national airline operating a network operation are likely to require. I mean, their requirements are probably not going to be that much different from a large network operator such as Ansett. In terms of the other types of air services, we've had different airlines operating out of Whangarei. They've tended to be quite specific services. Some of them and they've come and gone, unfortunately. We know from other airports in the country where in New Zealand have pulled back from providing a service that there are other options, including Air Chatham's. But again, it's a different type of service, and to some extent, the fact that we've dealt with Air New Zealand, as I've said, is to some extent they're a proxy about what a major airline operating a national service would likely to provide. Now, the limitations on CAA would still apply irrespective of what sort of aircraft we're dealing with in terms of the 50-seater Q300. That would still be the same sort of limitations on the existing airport. But you potentially could have your smaller aircraft coming in, but they're not likely to be providing the same sort of network service that we currently enjoy with the national carrier.
That's great, thanks. Hey, just looking at the time, we're getting pretty late, so I think we're going to burn through a few of these last questions now. Our viewership is starting to dwindle, so we'll just we'll look at wrapping this up. But we have got a few questions just here that we want to just quickly address. So first of all, Greg asks, have you sought legal opinions on all the options to confirm consentability for each site under RMA?
Graham, any comments on that?
In short, no, we haven't sought that, but there is the opportunity to do that once we proceed to the next stage. It's unlikely that there would be a significant legal obstacle. We've looked at things like covenanted QE2 sites and those sorts of matters. I mean, this is the type of development investigation that's undertaken for major infrastructure all the time, so I wouldn't anticipate that there would be a specific legal hurdle to any one of these three sites.
Very good, thanks. John asks, what about Tiriti or Waitangi implications, especially for reuse of the land at Whangarei?
Okay. So, in the discussions we've had through the another group that's been formed as part of the study, the Mana Whenua Advisory Group, members of that group have advised that there are treaty of Waitangi claims on the land at Whangarei, and so we're aware of that. And as I mentioned earlier on, the actual owner of the land under the of the land associated with the Whangarei Airport is the Crown. And if the airport was relocated from there, no doubt that is one consideration that they would have in terms of its future use.
Very good, thanks. Chris asked a bit earlier, would there be time or like hour restrictions in place at any of these sites to limit noise? How would that be managed?
Graham?
Well, again, that'll be part of the detailed planning, looking at the numbers of people who are within the airport noise exposure limits and looking at a detailed map of acoustic boundaries for the airport. If there were significant numbers of sensitive users within the airport noise footprint, then yes, there would be some restrictions and limitations on hours imposed, but we don't have that sort of detail as yet.
Very good, thanks. And our final question for tonight is from Hayley. She says, after 30th of June, when the council has decided on the site it wants to go forward with, will that be made public immediately?
Simon, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, that information will be in public, so you'll know.
So just to expand on that, the hearings that are set down for the 9th are public hearings, and the report that will be going to council on the 30th will be public and published before the meeting on the 30th, and meeting on the 30th will be open to the public, and therefore the results of the decision that council make on the 30th will be immediately available to all those in attendance and those who choose to view the meetings through Facebook and other options.
Yeah, that's right. Just to add to that from council communications is that all meetings of the full council at the moment are live streamed and the recordings are available afterwards. That brings us to the end of the questions that we're going to be answering. Greetings again to the 41 people who are still watching live on Facebook and the few people we still have on Teams as well. Just want to say, thank you to our members of the public for joining us tonight. Thanks for being open-minded about this. Thanks for asking such excellent questions. Frankly, these are really good, and I really hope that we've helped people understand the ins and outs of this very big decision that we have to make. Remember that the councillors are making this decision, but they're making it with your input. So you can go to our website until the 25th of May, that's 1 week from today, and have your say on this issue, our airport location study. If you just go to the front page at wdc.govt.nz, then you'll find it under the Have Your Say tab. Once again, thank you everybody for your participation tonight. I'm going to end the Facebook live stream now, and for people in the Teams meeting, we'll just have you stay on the call for a moment. Thanks again, and good night. Okay, thanks. I can confirm that that's ended now on the Facebook live stream. Yeah, so we had between 40 and 70 people joining us. We still also have some members of the public in the Teams meeting here. So just so those people know, I'm about to remove you as well. We've got a final question from O&H Krollman. I'm pretty sure that's Ollie, and an H as well. Thanks for the opportunity to ask questions and for holding an online meeting. For what it's worth as well, we had lots of other good feedback coming through, just people indicating that they were grateful. So I hope I didn't bore you by dumping praise on our members of the public at the end there as well. Yeah. For members of the public, for attendees here, I'm just going to kick you out. Sorry, please don't take it personally. Thank you very much for being here, and we're just going to have a very quick debrief.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.